Catalytic converters. Uh, Almost every car has them at this point. I mean, and they've had them since 1975. Think of it as an afterburner for your vehicle. Uh, they store and release oxygen. It's a treatment for what comes out of out of the engine. They they are a secondary combustion event outside of the cylinder. They take any hydrocarbons or CO or NOx that comes out of the engine, and just like what it does inside the combustion chamber, it breaks the molecular bond and then it recombines them with oxygen, turning HC into CO2 and H2O, water, or taking CO, adding extra O's to it and making it CO2, or removing some of the oxygen from the NOx. That would be considered a three-way cat. Now, in this, older ones were just, like a oxidation catalyst only. They didn't do anything with NOx. NOx needs to be reduced first. The older ones were pellet design. They all came with stainless steel cases and heat shields. The reason why they come with heat shields is because they get very, very hot, and we don't want anything on the ground catching on fire because of it. Oil-soaked pizza boxes in your garage, which has happened, or parking on grass, grassy areas, which has happened. So we look at what's inside. It's a substrate that's made up of different chemicals, different wash coats, with platinum and palladium and rhodium. These guys work together to create the catalyst effect. Now, a catalyst is just something that promotes a chemical reaction without consuming itself. So we have, combinations of these metals in the substrate and the wash coat that promotes this chemical reaction. And the cheaper cats are exactly that. They are cheaper cats. They have less of the more expensive stuff. That makes them not as efficient and doesn't last as long. Remember, manufacturers need to warranty the catalytic converter for 8 years, 80,000 miles. So they want to make sure that it lasts that long. And a cat has to be up to 90% efficiency in order to pass. If it drops below that, well, then it's a failed cat. Get it? All right. I'm just going to leave this here, the Cerium, good stuff. Oxidation catalysts only, pre-1975. They were actually pellet filled. They were filled with these little tiny pellets. It's almost, they looked about the same as like what would be in a beanbag chair. They were little white pellets. And the thought was there was actually a little hatch that you could unscrew, and if something happened to it, you could pour these pellets out and throw them away, is what we were told, and then fill the catalytic converter with new pellets. That made these pellets, these catalytic converters, they rattled when you hit them. New ones don't do that. Three-way cats. This is called a three-way cat because it deals with NOx and CO and HC. So they can be single or dual bed designs, and all that means is there can be a separation in between the two, or on some, I'll pick on Ford, you see it has like two separate catalytic converters. It's just they're the two, an oxidation and reduction cat, which oxidizes adds oxygen to the CO and the H's and C's to give us O2 and CO2. And then we have the reduction one is second. That's the one that deals with NOx. And what that means is it has to break the chemical bond when it comes into there to strip some of the oxygen off of it. So the reduction cat typically gets its oxygen from the NOx stuff, gases that come through. I hope that makes sense. Single bed converters just are one monolithic substrate. The substrate itself, I'm talking about the parts that are in there. I'll show you a couple pictures here in a second. But just if you look at this thing, it is they're generally made out of like ceramic. It's kind of like what Mom's Good China is made out of. You know, it's very hard, but it's also brittle. Uh, and these are sized specifically for the motor. I mean, you know, you look at some of these free-flowing aftermarket cats, and they run dyno tests on them, and they're really not as good as the factory cats. But a factory cat is $1,000 or something. Okay, feed some terms. Feed gases, what comes out of the engine into the catalytic converter. So that's feeding into the cat. And then we have the catalyst, which is, you know, the substrate that's inside. The wash coat, that's dipped in, the substrate is dipped in this, and typically it's heat cured. And then remove, absorption, and desorption are some terms you need to know. So what happens is the CO comes in, it gets, you know, absorbed into the wash coat and into the substrate, and it breaks the chemical bond, or actually it just adds oxygen, and then CO2 desorbs. It releases CO2, so it tracks the CO, adds extra oxygen, then lets it out. HC is kind of the same thing, except it has to break any bonds that are you know, holding the H's and C's together. If it's not, then it'll just bring in the H's and C's and put some oxygen on them and turn them into CO2 and H2O. And then it desorbs out of the substrate as it's, anyways. And then NOx is kind of done a little differently. CO is brought in. Remember, CO really wants to be CO2. It just needs an extra O. Well, we can pick up the extra O and from the NOx, because that's a whole string of O's, because that's what the little X is, NOx. Yeah. NOx, the X is nitrogen oxide. The X is a variable for any number. So the worse the NOx get, the more of a O's it has attached to it. But if we release some of those O's in the catalytic converter, we can use them to convert the HC. And as an extra benefit, we get the HC reacting with the extra O's coming from the NOx, and it changes it as well. Now, we still release the N2, which is the naturally occurring nitrogen. That's what we breathe. It's 78% of our atmosphere. Anyways, operations. What does it do inside? Well, it gets very, very hot. Minimum internal temperature for light off is 500 to 600 degrees. The chemical reaction itself adds about 200 degree increase in temperature across the catalytic converter, which we can actually measure. You can get in there with your infrared temp gun and measure at the front of the cat and at the back of the cat, and it should pick up some temperature across the catalytic converter to let you know that it's lit off. Typical internal temperatures is about 1,000 degrees. However, if it gets too hot, it melts. And then be very, very careful, because the case itself can be, you know, 300, 400, 500 degrees. That'll sear a nice steak or a hand. Some problems for the catalytic converter. Lead is a problem. It has to be replaced if there's any lead in it. Used to be 1 million years ago that, you know, when unleaded gasoline came out, engines couldn't handle the no lead part, so they actually added some lead, but then that destroyed the catalytic converter and people were mad. Carbon can be an issue, but we can burn that off if we fix the overrich condition. It should burn off. good highway crews will usually take care of it. Phosphorus usually comes from burning engine oil. That'll junk a cat too. So if your engine burns oil, that's a problem for your cat. It's going to go bad. Even if you have an oil leak that's leaking on the manifolds, the exhaust manifolds, and then the air intake is sucking that burning oil smell into the engine, that can hurt the catalytic converter. Sulfur, you get that strong rotten egg smell. Usually if you just switch over to a better quality fuel, like the Chevrons or the Shells or, a company-owned mobile station, they have tier 2 gas, which has low sulfur in it already. So, if you switch, a lot of times it'll burn it off, but sometimes not. It'll clog up the cat with sulfur. I'll show you a picture. And then silicon. Usually this is from using the wrong gasketing system, the wrong, stuff when you're applying, valve covers and stuff. Don't use bathtub caulk. Wrong stuff. That's bad. And that'll just junk a cat. All right, so testing the cat. There's a couple ways to do it. I like to look at O2 storage because that's easy. Some of these other ones were much more difficult. So we're actually going to look at O2 storage when we got out in the lab. That one's pretty simple to do, although the car's got to be running well in order to do it. And then delta temp is actually pretty easy. Just measure the inlet and outlet temperature. Works great. Now, O2 testing. And this is what we're going to actually look at. And if we look at this diagram right here, this is, before pre-cat and after the cat. So this is 1 and this would be 2, oxygen sensor 1 and oxygen sensor 2. So if we look at this, this is what they say that you see is no activity on the back O2 sensor, and that tells you have a good cat. Or if you have activity on the back O2 sensor, that tells you you have a bad one. Well, that's not exactly true. So here, let me run through it real fast. It's really how it reacts. The catalytic converter stores and releases oxygen. An oxygen sensor sees oxygen. So that rear O2 sensor is looking at the oxygen coming out of the cat. It's not typically the oxygen coming out of the engine. Remember, we got a front O2 sensor that does that. I'm pretty sure you guys have all seen, like a front O2 sensor switching rich, switching lean, going rich and lean and rich and lean and rich and lean. And the back one is just kind of sitting there. So if I look at this thing and I get it to go into an RL transition, it is this space that I'm looking at between these two. Now I can do this up on the rich side, or I can do it on the lean side. I'm going to show you how to do it on the lean side. It's a little easier than trying to do it on the rich side. Although I can, it's just a little more problematic. Now, this is exactly what the computer does. When it's driving around, you're up steady cruise. Usually these things are tested, high speed and a low speed cat test. This is what the computer does. It'll drive it rich, okay, drive the actual fuel control richer and richer, just marginally so, to get the cat to store lean. And then it'll, so the cat is full of oxygen, it'll get to store lean, and then it'll snap the fuel control rich. You don't know this is happening. It does it all by itself. Usually it's steady cruise down the highway, or that's the high-speed one, or the low-speed one where, you're just, 30 miles an hour or less. So it goes into this cat testing mode where it starts driving fuel control. You're not adjusting the throttle at all. Matter of fact, you start adjusting the throttle too much, it'll suspend that test and wait for another opportunity to do it. And you can see it happen if you watch on the scan tool. You'll see the rear O2 sensor start to ratchet up, and you'll see it start to ratchet down. It's either doing a rich-lean transition or a lean-rich transition. And this is how the computer does it. And it's literally looking at this section right here. How long does this time take for the cat to react? Longer it takes, the better off it is at storing and releasing oxygen. Get it? And I'm going to show you how to do this on the scan tool and get out in the lab. Bad catalytic converters. Failed the emissions test. Generally, it's a bad, it sets a check engine light. Those things are pretty accurate as long as that rear O2 sensor is okay. And sometimes they're not. And sometimes what happens is somebody will replace the front O2 sensor because it's bad, and the back one is just sluggish. It's aged as well. So we have to look at, how good that rear O2 sensor is as well. My suggestion is if one went bad, just replace them both. You're better off. And as a matter of fact, if you got one replaced, replace all of them. You're just better off. It'll work better. But I understand that's an expensive proposition. My personal cars, that's what I'm doing. All right. Aftermarket replacement cats. Those cheap ones that you see, the $149 ones, yeah, they're great. But a lot of times, those things don't last a year or two. And you're in there replacing the darn thing again. Here's the tip. California, I'll pick on California, personal California, but they have more stringent requirements for aftermarket cats. Buy the aftermarket cat that says California compliant. It'll last a lot longer. It costs you a little more, but it will last longer. I'm also not a big fan of these high flow cats. I've seen way too many of them fail earlier than they probably should have. The law part. Most people don't realize this, but defective catalytic converters, if you're working in a shop, need to be tagged with the repair order number, year, make, and model, reason for replacement, and kept on hand for 15 days. Man, don't yell at me. That is the law. You can be fined if it's not there. Just saying. Do they come in? Yeah. Remember 5 or 6 years ago, some EPA came into a bunch of sites, a bunch of repair shops here in where I live, and busted quite a few of them, fined a few out of existence. Fair? No, but there you go. Okay, catalytic converters, man. Watch my next video on catalytic converter diagnosis. Okay.